Officer Ryan Coleman screamed at a black jogger for running in the wrong neighborhood, shoving him like a criminal in front of everyone, only to realize moments later the man he humiliated was the state's governor, Elijah Brooks. A simple jog turned into a public disgrace, exposing the arrogance and injustice buried deep in everyday life. How does it feel when the one shouting for control suddenly loses all of it? If that hits you hard, tap like and share. Let's uncover what really happened that morning. I was there that morning in Ridgewood Hills, the kind of suburb that sells itself as perfection. White picket fences, fresh-cut lawns, sparrows stitching thin threads of song into the air. If you'd asked me then what trouble could possibly find a street like ours, I would have said none. Trouble belongs somewhere else. That's what we like to tell ourselves in neighborhoods like this. Elijah Brooks passed me on the sidewalk just after sunrise. I'd seen him before, a black man in his early 50s, steady and quiet, the kind of runner who saves his breath for thinking. He paused at his porch before he started, fingers resting on a framed photograph just inside the window. A young man in uniform stared back at him with that half-smile soldiers learn to make. Elijah whispered something I couldn't catch, then lifted his wrist. The watch on it was old, the plating rubbed thin by time. He touched the face of it like a ritual, then stepped into the morning. If you've ever watched someone run for reasons that have nothing to do with miles, you know the look. Elijah wasn't chasing speed. He was chasing memory. It felt like the street itself slowed down to keep faith with him, his shoes making soft, even sounds. The kind of breathing that says a man has learned to carry weight without showing it. I remember thinking how calm it all was, how ordinary and safe. He didn't run to escape, I would tell my wife later. He ran to remember. That's how it felt, like each step lost a little pain and found a little peace. He passed the flag by the school, dipped his head, then cut onto Sycamore where the maples cast long, kind shadows. The sun reached over the rooftops. Someone's sprinkler ticked to life, a sound that in Ridgewood means everything's fine. I was 2 houses behind, walking our old beagle who prefers history to hurry, when the siren tore the sky in half. It wasn't a long blast, just a sharp surgical cut that tells you a different story is about to begin. The patrol car slid to the curb with the kind of confidence only authority can afford. My dog flinched. I did too. Officer Ryan Coleman stepped out. 38 white squared-off jaw that looked borrowed from a recruitment poster. He had the walk of a man who believed the block belonged to him. Some officers carry calm the way surgeons do. Coleman carried heat. He lifted his chin at Elijah like he'd caught him where he shouldn't be. "Hey," he barked. "You live around here." Elijah stopped. He didn't rear up or shrink down. He just turned the way a man turns when he's been asked the same question 100 times by people who don't really want the answer. "Just running, officer," he said. His voice was level, almost gentle, like he was offering the morning back to both of them. Coleman's eyes moved past Elijah to the painted porches and the pale faces behind glass. It wasn't just a scan, it was an inventory. The kind that counts some people as proof and other people as problems. Yeah, he let the word hang like bait. You people always have a reason. I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count. It didn't land like curiosity, it landed like a verdict. The kind that's been rehearsed for generations. It wasn't just a question I heard myself think even then. It was a verdict handed down by history. The air changed, I swear it did. Sunrise became something heavier, like someone had pulled a shade over the day. The sparrows got quiet, or maybe I just stopped hearing them. Elijah looked at him, not up, not down, just straight. I saw the tiniest breath pass through his shoulders, the way a man settles a memory back into place so it won't spill into the present. He placed a palm over that old watch as if to steady time itself. "I run this street every morning," he said. "Same as today." Coleman took a step closer. "ID. I didn't bring one," Elijah replied. "I'm running, not driving." I noticed his tone, respect without surrender. It's a hard line to walk, and he walked it like he'd had practice. The beagle nosed the grass, pretending not to notice the weather inside the moment. Across the way, a mother slowed with her little boy. The kid looked from the uniform to the runner with the open, unarmored eyes only children still have. "Mom," he whispered, not nearly as quiet as he thought. "He's just running." "Come on," she murmured, though her feet didn't move. "Don't get involved." Coleman's jaw ticked, hands where I can see them. Elijah raised his hands to shoulder height. No tremor, no theater, just 2 open hands in a neighborhood that suddenly felt smaller than the man standing in it. "You're shouting at me, officer," he said, calm as a porch swing. "I can hear you just fine." For a beat, I thought Coleman might hear himself, might see the shape of the moment and choose a different one. But that's the secret about moments like these. They come preloaded with old stories. The uniform tells one, the watch tells another. In the street, we tell ourselves the one we want to be true. Coleman glanced up and down Sycamore again, like the houses were witnesses for the prosecution. "Where do you live?" he demanded. "3 blocks that way," Elijah said, nodding with his chin. "Try waving next time instead of aiming." It wasn't sharp enough to cut, but it was true enough to sting. Coleman's hand slid toward his radio. Authority loves paperwork when it thinks history is on its side. I could feel the neighborhood holding its breath. A curtain moved. A sprinkler clicked. The boy's hand found his mother's. Elijah's eyes went to the flag by the school and back to Coleman, and I had the sudden, ridiculous wish that the son would speak up and vouch for him. This is the part where people later say, how did it get so bad so fast? But it didn't get bad fast. It arrived right on time, called by a sentence, escorted by a siren, ushered in by a certainty that had nothing to do with facts. I remember Elijah's watch catching a low line of light, like a small, faithful moon on his wrist. He touched it once lightly, the way a man touches a name he refuses to forget. Then he steadied his breath and waited, as if he knew the next minute would test more than his patience. It would test the neighborhood. It would test us. I wish I could tell you honestly that the officer stood down, that he reconsidered, that the morning returned to what it had promised. But that isn't the story the street chose. And if you think this was just about one runner and one cop, you're not hearing what the siren said when it split our quiet in two. Coleman closed the distance between them like he was crossing enemy lines. "Let's see some ID," he said, his voice sharp, already carrying the tone of someone who had made up his mind. Elijah exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but from the discipline of a man who's learned that calm can be a shield. "Didn't bring one?" he said softly. "I run here every morning." Coleman smirked, tilting his head as if scanning a crime scene. "Every morning. Funny, I never saw you before." Elijah met his eyes steady and clear. "Maybe you weren't looking." The words were quiet but precise, like a scalpel. They didn't shout back, they simply left no room for doubt. Coleman's smirk vanished. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. Elijah raised both hands slowly, his breathing steady. "You're shouting at me, officer. I can hear you just fine." Across the street, a woman pushing a stroller froze. Her son, maybe 7 or 8, stared at the scene with innocent confusion. "Mom?" he whispered. "He didn't do anything wrong, right?" The woman hesitated, voice trembling, just enough to betray her fear. "Come on, honey." But her feet didn't move. Coleman's jaw tightened. "Where do you live?" 3 blocks that way," Elijah said, nodding gently down the road. "Try waving next time instead of aiming." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. The kind of silence that says more than shouting ever could. Coleman's hand twitched toward his radio, and with a deliberate click, he pressed the button. "Possible trespassing suspect on Sycamore," he said into the receiver. The word suspect hung in the air like a curse. I remember thinking how absurd it sounded, how fast respect can collapse when judgment gets there first. Elijah hadn't moved an inch, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done a thing, but exist in the wrong skin, on the wrong street, at the wrong time. He stood still, calm, but unyielding, the kind of stillness that speaks louder than shouting. His eyes carried something I can't quite describe, the quiet of a man who's been here before, who's fought this battle without fists or fury. Coleman paced slightly like a predator, uncertain whether to pounce or retreat. The sunlight bounced off his badge, catching Elijah's face in its glare. 2 men, one with authority, one with dignity, stood on the same street but lived in different Americas. The boy across the street squeezed his mother's hand. "Why is he yelling at that man?" he asked. She whispered, "Some people just don't see clearly, sweetheart." And in that whisper, I heard the whole story of our country. Coleman's voice rose again, almost defensive now, as if his own echo dared him to back down. "You fit the description," he muttered. Elijah's brow furrowed slightly. Description of what? But Coleman didn't answer. He didn't have one. I watched the scene tighten like a noose. The smell of morning grass was still there, but it felt wrong now, too sweet for something turning sour. I wanted to speak, to say, he lives here, to say stop, but fear has a way of pinning your voice to your ribs. Coleman's hand hovered over his holster, not to draw, but enough to remind everyone he could. Elijah noticed but didn't react. He simply lowered his hands halfway, palms still open, and said quietly, "You don't need that, officer. We're both just standing here." For a moment, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees like it was trying to break the tension for us, but it couldn't. Elijah looked at Coleman, really looked at him, and said, "You keep seeing threats where there are none. That's not safety. That's fear wearing a uniform." Coleman blinked, caught between offense and doubt. The words hit something deeper than pride, they hit conscience. Still, pride is a louder voice. He straightened, pressing his radio again, as if to drown out what he'd just heard. "I'm detaining him until I confirm ID," he said flatly. The woman gasped. The boy started to cry softly. And Elijah, he didn't flinch, didn't beg. He just sighed and whispered, "Then let's finish this mistake." The morning that had begun so peacefully now felt like a courtroom, without walls, neighbors as jurors, silence as the gavel. He didn't see a jogger that morning. He saw a threat. And in that stillness, the neighborhood decided which story it would believe next. "Put your hands on the hood," Coleman barked, his voice cutting through the air like a siren. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. He just walked toward the cruiser, calm and deliberate, and placed his hands flat on the metal. The hood was hot under the morning sun, the kind of heat that seeps through skin and bone. He didn't resist. He didn't talk back. But there was something in the quiet, something that made the silence feel heavier than any protest could. Coleman shoved him forward harder than he needed to. Elijah stumbled, catching himself halfway before his knee hit the ground. Then came the second shove, sharper, filled with that familiar rage that doesn't belong to justice, but to ego. Elijah went down this time, his palms scraping against the pavement. Blood beaded at his cheek, red against brown skin. Someone gasped. Then, as if the sound gave permission, phones began to rise. Screens glowed, lenses opened. "He's bleeding," a boy's voice shouted, trembling but clear. Across the street, the mother yanked her son closer. "Don't," she whispered, eyes darting between the officers and the phones. "Just don't get involved." Her voice cracked, not from coldness, but from that particular fear people carry when they realize right and safe don't always mean the same thing. Coleman looked around, saw the crowd gathering, but instead of backing off, he straightened to taller, puffed out his chest. He needed control back, needed to remind everyone who held the authority. "Stay where you are," he yelled at the onlookers. Elijah lifted his head slowly, meeting his eyes. Blood traced a thin line down the side of his face, catching light as it fell. He didn't look angry, he looked tired. "You really don't know who you're talking to, do you?" Elijah said quietly. Coleman sneered, his lip curling in that half smile that belongs to men who think they've already won. "Yeah, another big man with an attitude." The words hung between them, thin, sharp, poisonous. I could feel the tension crawl down the street like static looking for a place to land. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "This is getting bad." Someone else muttered, "Why doesn't he stop?" But no one stepped closer. It was safer to watch. It always is. And then Elijah did something I still can't forget. He turned not to Coleman, but to the boy. He met the child's eyes, the same boy who had cried out just moments before. And with a small, gentle nod, he smiled. It wasn't much, a faint curve of the lips, soft as forgiveness, but it was enough. It told that child everything words couldn't. You're right to feel this is wrong. You're right to care. And it's okay to look. For a second, the street fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop mid-note. Coleman's breathing was the only sound left, quick, uneven, defensive. The woman squeezed her son's shoulder and whispered, "Come on, sweetheart, let's go," though her feet were still planted in place. The boy didn't move either. He just stared wide-eyed, learning more about the world in 30 seconds than school would teach him in years. Coleman took another step forward, gripping Elijah's shoulder like he was afraid the man might vanish if he didn't hold him down. Elijah didn't flinch. He just looked past Coleman, past all of us, and said softly, "Be careful what kind of story you think you're in, officer. Some of them don't end the way you expect." Coleman's grip tightened. "Don't get smart with me." But Elijah wasn't being smart. He was being real, and everyone there could feel it. The crowd saw two men standing in the same sun. The truth saw two Americas. One believed power was earned by the badge on a chest. The other believed dignity was something no badge could take away. Coleman's hand fell away, but the damage was done. Not just to Elijah's face, but to the street itself, to the illusion that peace lived here untouched. The phones kept recording. Every blink, every breath, every drop of blood. Elijah stood back up slowly, dusting his hands off, like a man preparing for church, not confrontation. His gaze went again to the child across the road. Another small nod. Another quiet promise that he would not let this moment teach the wrong lesson. I swear that nod changed the air. The boy stopped crying. The mother wiped her eyes. Even Coleman's shoulders faltered for half a breath. It wasn't rebellion. It was grace. And standing there watching it unfold, I realized something that has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes the loudest voice in a fight is the one that refuses to shout. Elijah didn't raise his tone once, but somehow he was the only man anyone could hear. The second patrol car pulled up fast gravel, snapping under the tires. Doors opened before the wheels even stopped turning. Sergeant Helen Carter stepped out, mid-40s, white, the kind of officer whose presence usually quieted chaos. But not that morning. Ryan, she called, already reading the scene with a practiced eye. What's going on here? Coleman didn't turn toward her. He stood by the cruiser chest, rising and falling too fast. Suspicious man, he said flatly. Refused to show ID. Helen's gaze followed his hand to the man standing beside the hood, wrists still red from the pressure of Coleman's grip. Blood trickled down Elijah Brooks' temple, catching sunlight like it wanted to be seen. Yet he stood straight, breathing slow, the calm kind that doesn't come from ignorance, but from choice. Tell your man, Elijah said, voice low, measured to stop before he ruins more than his day. Helen hesitated. The way he said it, steady, quiet, certain, made her stomach tighten. Something about his tone didn't match the scene. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was authority. Ryan stopped yelling, she snapped. But Coleman, already sweating under his collar, barked louder instead. Ma'am, I've got it under control. He didn't. Everyone could see that. The crowd had doubled in size, neighbors stepping out from porches, a jogger pausing across the street, phones rising in silent accusation. Someone shouted, "Stop, he's bleeding." Helen turned sharply, trying to wave people back. Please, everyone. But the tide had turned. The more she spoke, the more phones pointed their lenses forward. The soft clicks and pings of recording apps filled the air, tiny mechanical witnesses that never forget. Elijah looked at them all, his face unreadable. He took a single step back, not to retreat, but to make room for what was coming. Then calmly he said, "Let them see." The words rolled out quiet, almost a whisper, yet they hit like thunder. The world needs to watch. Coleman froze. Helen did too. Even the crowd seemed to pause, as if those words carried weight too heavy for the moment to hold. I remember the way his voice sounded, not angry, not pleading, just resolute. It was the voice of a man who had run out of patience but not out of dignity. A woman nearby lowered her phone for a second, her eyes wet. God, she muttered, he's right. Then someone shouted, hashtag it, aren't jogging while black. And just like that, the story left the street. It shot into the airwaves, across the feeds, through the country's fragile conscience. Within minutes, the video hit every timeline, like a siren no one could turn off. Helen's radio crackled with dispatch chatter she couldn't quite process. Coleman's face had gone pale, though his hands still gripped his belt like the badge could save him from the truth unfolding. Elijah stood in the middle of it, all the blood, the noise, the eyes still, as a monument to everything the morning had broken. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Who is he?" But Elijah didn't answer. He didn't have to. The world was already finding out. The hum of phones recording blended with the sound of wind and tension. You could almost hear history pressing record. Helen swallowed hard, turning back toward Coleman. "Ryan," she said, quieter now, "I think you need to stop." But he didn't move. He was trapped in the moment he created, the point where anger becomes exposure. Elijah wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, his voice even. "Don't worry," he said. "This isn't about you yelling. It's about what you believe gives you the right to." And for the first time, Coleman didn't have a comeback. The crowd's murmurs grew, no one shouting now, just a low collective breath that sounded like disbelief and awakening mixed into one. Helen glanced around. She could feel the change, the way control had shifted from the badge to the lens. Elijah's eyes moved toward the nearest camera. Make sure it's clear, he said quietly, how calm I stayed. The woman filming nodded. Yes, sir. He nodded back once. And just like that, something in the air broke, not the tension, not yet, but the illusion that this was a small moment on a small street. It wasn't. It had become a mirror, one that showed us who we were and who we pretended to be. I remember thinking then, some truths don't whisper for long. Some truths need witnesses. And that morning the world was finally watching. Turn around, Coleman barked, his voice raw and desperate, the kind that belongs less to authority and more to fear of losing it. Elijah didn't move at first. He looked at him the way a calm sea looks at a storm, steady, unshaken. Then slowly he turned. Ryan, Sergeant Helen Carter's voice sliced through the air. I'm ordering you to stop. Coleman didn't even look at her. Then you deal with the paperwork, he snapped, his words dripping with defiance. The badge on his chest gleamed, but it didn't shine with honor anymore. It looked like a mirror that no longer wanted to reflect its owner. Elijah said nothing. He just stood there, breathing slow, shoulders still. His eyes carried no anger, just a tired understanding. It's okay, he said quietly, almost gently. Let him finish his mistake. The line hit like a confession. Helen froze halfway between stepping forward and staying still. The crowd gasped. The camera zoomed in, and Coleman, without hesitation, grabbed Elijah's wrist. The click of the handcuffs was louder than it should have been, sharp, metallic, final. Someone screamed, "What are you doing?" Another voice rose from the crowd, a woman near the curb, hand trembling as she held up her phone. Wait a second. Isn't that, she squinted, her voice cracking with disbelief. Isn't that Governor Brooks? For a moment, everything stopped. Even Coleman's grip loosened slightly, his brow furrowing, as if his brain couldn't process what his hands had just done. Helen's face went pale. Brooks, she whispered. No, that can't be. But Elijah looked up, eyes meeting hers, and in that single glance she knew. The calm, the authority in his tone, the gravity in his silence. It all made sense now. She stepped back like she'd just seen the ground open beneath her. The man who governed justice was now standing in its shadow. Coleman's lips parted. Governor. The word came out small, almost fragile. Elijah didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The look on Helen's face, the whispers spreading through the crowd, and the camera flashes snapping like lightning, they did the job for him. You just handcuffed the governor, someone shouted from across the street. The phones came up higher. The shouting turned into a wave, shock, disbelief, outrage. A neighbor cried, unbelievable. Another yelled, you better let him go. But it was too late. The video was already streaming. The hashtags were already forming. The crowd had become a courtroom and the world was the jury. Coleman tried to regain composure, but his voice shook. Everyone back up, Helen whispered. Ryan, what did you do? He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know anymore. Elijah stood still, hands cuffed behind him, his head lifted just enough to remind everyone that dignity isn't something you can lock away. His blood had dried at the edge of his hairline, but his posture, straight grounded, told a different story. You can restrain a man's body, but not his truth. Helen stepped forward again, this time softer. Sir, Governor Brooks. Elijah stopped her with a small shake of his head. It's fine, Sergeant. Just make sure your officers learn from this. The street fell quiet. Even the crowd hushed their anger, slowly turning into awe. Coleman swallowed hard, his hand still on the cuffs like he didn't dare let go. For a moment it looked like the weight of what he'd done might finally sink in. But pride is stubborn, and so is denial. He muttered, we'll sort it out at the station. Helen's voice cracked. Ryan, for God's sake. But he was already leading Elijah toward the patrol car. The cameras followed, recording every second, every step, every echo of boots on asphalt. The woman who had recognized him now shouted, louder, tears in her voice. You can't do that. That's our Governor. Coleman shoved the back door open. The gesture quick, defensive. Elijah ducked his head and stepped inside, calm, deliberate, as though he were entering a meeting instead of a cell. As the door shut behind him, someone yelled, oh my God, they really did it. The crowd erupted, voices, shouts, disbelief, and the endless clicking of record buttons. The live stream counter ticked higher and higher, the view count exploding as fast as outrage travels online. Helen stood frozen by the curb, her hands still raised as if trying to stop time. What have you done, Ryan? She whispered. Coleman didn't answer. He just looked at the door of the cruiser, breathing hard. Inside the car, Elijah sat upright, gazing through the glass at the chaos outside. For a fleeting second, his reflection overlapped with Coleman's. In the window, the powerful and the powerless, sharing the same frame. The irony was unbearable. The governor of the state, the man who had signed reforms for police accountability, was now sitting in the backseat of his own failure. The siren wailed to life, a cruel echo of the one that had started it all. Helen turned away, pressing her hand to her forehead. The crowd began shouting again, not just at Coleman, but at what he represented. And as the cruiser pulled off, one final voice pierced through the noise, caught perfectly by the live stream. The man who governs justice just got handcuffed by it. The feed went viral in seconds. Millions watched as the car disappeared down Sycamore Street. I remember standing there, phone buzzing in my pocket, knowing the world had just seen something it could never unsee. That morning had started with a run. Now it had turned into a reckoning. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room hummed with that tired, lonely sound you only hear in places built for confessions. The air was still cold enough to feel sterile. Elijah Brooks sat at the metal table, hands cuffed, posture straight. He didn't fidget. He didn't speak. He looked like a man waiting for time to catch up to him. Coleman sat across from him, tapping a pen against a clipboard. The arrogance he wore outside had thinned, replaced by something else, nervous energy masquerading as control. Name, Coleman asked, not looking up. Elijah Brooks. Coleman let out a small laugh, a dry, humorless sound. Cute, he muttered. You're not the governor? Elijah's expression didn't change. I didn't say I was cute, he replied softly. Coleman stopped tapping the pen. His jaw tensed, but he didn't respond. He just leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if staring harder might make the truth different. Across the room, Sergeant Helen Carter stood near the computer typing. Her shoulders were tense, eyes flicking between the monitor and the man sitting in front of her. Something wasn't adding up, and her instincts screamed it. Ryan, she said, voice careful. His name. It matches the governor's ID number. Coleman scoffed. Coincidence. Helen frowned. Coincidences don't have fingerprints. She typed faster, pulled up the state database, and froze. Her face changed the way faces do when reality rearranges itself in front of you. She turned toward the wall, her eyes catching on a framed photograph, the governor shaking hands with the President of the United States. And there he was, same eyes, same calm. She blinked, stepping closer to the picture, as if it could possibly be wrong. Then her radio crackled. Dispatch to Carter Governor's office calling. They're asking if anyone's seen him. He missed his morning briefing. The words hung in the air like smoke. Helen turned slowly toward Coleman. Ryan, she said, her voice unsteady now. Take off those cuffs. He looked up confused. What take? Them. Off. He hesitated, half smiling, like she'd told a joke he didn't get. Sergeant, come on. You can't actually think I said she cut him off. I'll take them off. Because you just arrested the governor of this state. The room went silent except for the faint buzzing of the light above. Coleman blinked once, then twice. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The pen rolled off the table and clattered to the floor, echoing too loud for the space. Elijah didn't move. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply looked at Coleman with the same calm he'd carried since the street. Governor Coleman finally whispered the word, catching in his throat. Elijah nodded once, slowly. That's right. Helen moved toward him, fumbling with the key to the cuffs. Her hands were trembling. When the metal opened, the sound was different this time. Not harsh, not final, but fragile, like something breaking inside everyone in the room. Coleman stepped back, staring at the table as if it might explain how the morning had gone so wrong. I didn't know, he stammered. Elijah rubbed his wrist, not in pain, but as if testing whether the marks were real. That's the problem, officer, he said quietly. You never know until it's too late. Helen swallowed hard. Sir, I'm so sorry. I should have. Elijah raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. You followed your gut. That's more than most people do. But now you'll have to decide what to do with what you know. He stood slowly, his presence filling the small room in a way no uniform could. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and looked directly at Coleman. The younger officer couldn't meet his eyes. His lips trembled, pride slipping away inch by inch. Elijah walked toward the door, paused, and turned back. Mr. Coleman, he said, voice soft but firm, there's something you should remember about power. It doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off. It reveals who you really are. Coleman's swallowed eyes fixed on the floor. Helen opened the door, her voice almost a whisper. Sir, what do you want us to do now? Elijah stopped in the doorway. Do your job, he said. Just do it better. He stepped into the hallway where reporters were already gathering outside, their voices muffled by the thick station walls. Helen followed him with her eyes until he disappeared around the corner. Behind her, Coleman still hadn't moved. The cuffs lay on the table, open but heavy. He stared at them, at his reflection in the steel, and finally whispered to no one in particular. God, what have I done? From where I stood, I could see the truth sink into him, the kind that doesn't make noise, but leaves a mark you can't wash off. And that was when I realized justice had just handcuffed itself. And for the first time, it was forced to look in the mirror. The room thickened after the cuffs came off, like the air itself had weight. No one moved. The fluorescent light hummed a small, merciless truth-teller overhead. Coleman finally found his voice, but it came out in pieces. Sir? I didn't. Elijah looked at him, steady, patient, unblinking. You meant every word when you said, you people. He said, quiet enough to make every syllable land. That's what hurts most. Coleman flinched like he'd been struck. He glanced at Helen as if she might loan him a better answer, then back at the table. His hands were open on his knees, palms up like someone waiting for rain that wouldn't come. Governor, we're so sorry, Helen said. The title wasn't for show. It was a fact she was still fitting in her mouth. I should have seen it. I should have. You don't need to know me to do right by me, Elijah replied. No anger, no heat, just a line that closed the distance between principle and practice. He could have twisted the knife. He didn't. He set it on the table and let them look at it. Coleman folded forward, elbows on his thighs, head hanging. He didn't dare meet Elijah's eyes. The uniform on his shoulders seemed to sag, like it finally understood the weight it had been pretending to carry. On the steel tabletop, the open handcuffs lay, where Helen had left them, two small crescents of light. Elijah reached over, touched them with his fingers, the way you touch a photograph of someone you once knew. Then he lifted them, studied the curve of the metal, and set them down again. These belong to the system, he said softly, not to me. It wasn't a flourish. It was a diagnosis. You could feel the room receive it. From where I stood half hidden by the doorframe, I watched Coleman's face do the arithmetic of consequence. You could almost see the scenes reappearing, not from outside the crowd, the phones, the bleeding, but from inside the moment he decided a stranger was a problem, the way the word suspect had slid too easily out of his mouth. He swallowed hard. I thought I was doing my job, he murmured, and even he didn't sound convinced. Elijah nodded just once. Doing a job is different from doing it right. Helen took a breath, then another, as though the oxygen in the station had changed composition. Sir, she said, I don't know how to make this right, but I can make sure it's not wasted. That's the work, Elijah answered. Not fixing one moment, fixing the pattern that makes the moment inevitable. Silence again. Not empty, the kind with a spine, the kind that stands up and waits to be answered. Coleman rubbed his eyes, the heel of his hand pressing against a headache that wasn't new so much as newly named. I didn't see you, he said, voice breaking. I saw what I was taught to see. Elijah's gaze softened, not indulgent, not absolving, just human. Then unlearn it, he said. Decide that seeing better is part of the job. He stood. Nothing dramatic, no chair scraping, just a man rising because it was time. He smoothed his jacket, rolled his wrists once, as if trying on freedom to check the fit, and looked around the room, the checklist, the one-way mirror, the old paint on the cinder block wall. If he was tempted to lecture, he didn't. He left them the silence to do it for him. At the edge of the table, the cuffs caught the light again. He lifted them a second time and placed them more deliberately in the center, as if returning a tool to the bench after proving it could cut. Leave them there, he said. It'll help you remember what they're for. Helen nodded, eyes glassy. Yes, sir. He headed for the door. Before he reached it, he paused just a heartbeat and turned to Coleman. You get to choose what happens to you next, he said. Not because of me, because of the truth you're standing in. Coleman didn't trust his voice. He gave the smallest nod a man can give without pretending it's anything else. Elijah pushed the door open. The hallway beyond was louder phones, reporters, the outer world already rearranging itself around what had happened. He stepped into that noise the same way he'd stepped into the morning calm, deliberate, almost gentle. And then he was gone. Helen watched the doorway like it could still return him. She whispered barely above the hum of the light, "That man just walked away freer than any of us." I believed her. Freedom didn't look like speed. It looked like stillness that couldn't be purchased, borrowed, or pinned down. It looked like a man who refused to let someone else tell him why he was running. Coleman finally sat back, spine to the chair, eyes on the cuffs he'd once used like punctuation. He didn't touch them. He didn't need to. The room had already turned them into a mirror. I've told people since that day the lesson didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with quiet, one sentence at a time, until there was nothing left to argue with. Some truths are loud because they've never been heard. Others are quiet because they've always been true. Freedom isn't the absence of chains, it's the presence of conscience. And in that small fluorescent room, conscience finally showed up. That night, the city outside the precinct was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after too much noise. Inside his patrol car, Ryan Coleman sat in the dark, the dashboard lights flickering faintly across his face. His hands rested on the steering wheel, the same hands that had shoved Elijah Brooks just hours earlier. Now they were trembling. He stared at them for a long time. "I keep seeing his face," he whispered to himself, like a man confessing to the night. He didn't even look angry. From the passenger seat, Sergeant Helen Carter's voice broke the silence. "Then do something about it." Coleman turned his head slightly, eyes tired. "I don't know how." Helen leaned back, watching him, her tone calm but sharp. "Start by listening, Ryan. You don't have to fix everything tonight, but you sure as hell need to hear what it's been trying to tell you." Coleman didn't answer. The sound of rain tapping on the windshield filled the space between them. He pressed his palms together like maybe if he prayed hard enough, he could rewind time to before the siren, before the shouting, before the cuffs. But regret doesn't work that way. It's not a rewind, it's a replay you can't turn off. He finally asked, almost under his breath, "Do you think he'll forgive me?" Helen looked out the window at the wet pavement glowing under the streetlight. "I think forgiveness isn't the part that should scare you," she said. "What should scare you is whether you'll ever forgive yourself." Coleman's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something, defend himself, explain, justify, but every sentence that came to mind sounded like a lie even before it left his lips. So he said nothing. He just stared at his reflection in the glass, a uniformed man who no longer recognized who he was. The camera light from someone's phone flashed across the windshield as another officer walked by, reminding him that this wasn't just a bad night. It was history now. Recorded, shared, judged. Start by listening. Helen's words echoed again. He nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if it meant understanding or surrender. Across town, in the quiet of his office, Governor Elijah Brooks sat alone under the soft glow of a desk lamp. The video played on the screen before him, the same moment replayed from half a dozen angles. The shouts, the fall, the blood, the silence that followed. He watched it without flinching, but his face wasn't angry, it was weary. The kind of weariness that comes from fighting the same fight through different decades. The video ended. He didn't hit replay. He just sat there, the still frame frozen on, the moment his head lifted, eyes steady beneath the chaos. "We've come so far," he said quietly, almost to himself, yet not far enough. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking softly beneath him. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, and then almost in rhythm, the small worn watch on his wrist began its steady beat. Tick, tick, tick. He turned his wrist, studying it for a moment. The watch was old, its glass slightly cracked, its strap faded, a relic from a son who never came home. It had seen battlefields, protests, and podiums, and now it had seen handcuffs. Elijah smiled faintly, a sad, private kind of smile. "You'd think," he whispered, "after all this time we'd learn." He rose from his chair, walking to the window that overlooked the city. The rain outside caught the reflection of streetlights, turning everything into rivers of golden gray. Somewhere below, sirens wailed again, a reminder that the world still hadn't quieted. But his watch kept ticking. Tick, tick. The sound filled the room, steady and patient, like a heartbeat that refused to give up. He touched the watch gently and said under his breath, "As long as this keeps going, I'll keep believing." Outside, the first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, pale light creeping over the skyline. It was still fragile, still far away, but it was there. And for the first time that night, Elijah Brooks closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in hope, the quiet kind that knows tomorrow might hurt, but still shows up anyway. Some nights end with answers. Others end with questions. This one ended with a heartbeat. The press hall was packed, bright lights, flashing cameras, the hum of whispered anticipation filling every inch of air. Reporters lined the aisles, shoulder to shoulder, microphones outstretched, ready to devour whatever came next. The story had already made national news, but now the world wanted to see what the man at the center of it would say. Governor Elijah Brooks walked onto the stage calm as ever. No guards flanking him, no teleprompter, just a man and a microphone. The flashes hit him like lightning, but he didn't blink. His suit was simple dark blue, the small watch on his wrist glinting under the lights, its steady tick hidden beneath the noise. He rested both hands on the podium and looked out over the sea of faces. For a long moment he didn't speak. You could have heard a pin drop. Then with the kind of quiet that demanded attention, he began. "I know what you've all seen," he said, his voice steady, resonant. "You've watched a moment that should have never happened. A moment where fear was louder than reason. But this story isn't about me. It's about what we do now that the truth is visible." The room stilled. Even the cameras seemed to pause for breath. He continued, his tone deepening with emotion that never quite spilled over. "I forgive him, but forgiveness doesn't erase truth. It reveals it." The sentence landed heavy, echoing through the hall like a verdict that carried mercy. Helen Carter sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, her uniform freshly pressed, but her eyes tired. A few rows behind her, Officer Ryan Coleman sat at the end of the aisle, back straight, head bowed. He wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to listen. Elijah looked straight ahead, scanning the room without searching for anyone in particular. Justice, he said, doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in the heart. So today we start something new. He reached into his jacket pocket, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and read aloud. "Effective immediately, I'm launching an initiative called Justice Starts with Respect, a statewide reform program dedicated to rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the people they serve." The crowd murmured, reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, but Elijah's voice didn't waver. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about prevention, about teaching our officers that authority without empathy is just fear wearing a badge." He looked up from the paper, his gaze soft but piercing. "We will train every officer in this state to understand the weight of their words, not just the force of their hands." Helen exhaled shakily. Coleman's eyes lifted red and glassy. Elijah went on. "Officer Coleman realized my title too late, but I hope he never forgets the lesson, because I wasn't asking for respect as a governor. I was asking for it as a man." That line changed the temperature of the room. You could feel the collective heartbeat slow, the weight of recognition pressing on everyone listening. Near the back, a small movement caught the eye. A woman stood up, the same woman who'd watched the arrest from across the street. Her young son tugged her sleeve, unsure if he should follow. She smiled down at him and whispered, "Go ahead." The boy rose beside her, his small hands clapping, first hesitant but determined. The sound was soft, almost fragile at first, then it grew. One by one, others joined in. The applause spread across the hall like a wave, but it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like release. The narrator's voice broke through softly, carrying the weight of that silence-turned sound. It wasn't applause, it was a sigh of hope. Elijah lowered his eyes for a brief moment, hands still resting on the podium, his shoulders neither proud nor heavy, just human. And then something rare happened. The entire room rose to its feet, not because of power, not because of fear, but because they'd witnessed dignity return to a place where it had been missing. The standing ovation rolled through the hall, and for once the noise wasn't chaotic, it was healing. Elijah stepped back from the microphone, nodding once quietly. "Thank you," he said. "Let's make this moment worth remembering." As the lights dimmed and the cameras faded, the narrator's final words closed the scene. That day, justice wasn't shouted into being. It was rebuilt one heartbeat at a time by the power of compassion. It was another morning, the same road, the same whisper of wind through the trees, but everything somehow felt different. The sun was soft, painting Ridgewood Hills in a gold so gentle it almost apologized for what it had witnessed days before. Officer Ryan Coleman was running. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. Sweat rolled down his neck, his shirt clinging to his back. Every step felt heavier than the one before, not from the distance, but from the memories chasing him. When he reached the corner near Sycamore Avenue, that corner, a car slowed beside him. The window rolled down. Elijah Brooks stepped out. Same calm, same quiet confidence. No press, no guards, no crowd. Just him. "Mind if I join?" Elijah asked, smiling faintly. Coleman froze for half a second, then nodded. "Of course, sir." They started jogging, side by side, their steps falling into rhythm. No words at first, just the steady sound of shoes against pavement, and two lives moving through the same silence from opposite sides of experience. For a while that silence was enough. Then Coleman spoke, his voice low and rough. "I still remember the day I shouted at you." Elijah didn't slow down. "Good," he said without looking over. "That means you learned something." Coleman gave a small, almost broken laugh. "It took me too long to understand what I was really shouting at." Elijah glanced at him, his tone gentle. "Most people don't realize they're not yelling at a person, they're yelling at what they fear." They kept running. A quiet breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of morning dew. "I thought I was enforcing the law," Coleman said. "Turns out I was enforcing my bias." Elijah nodded, his breathing, even his gaze fixed ahead. "The law is a tool," he said, "but respect, that's a choice." They reached the small square at the end of the block. A flagpole stood there, tall and unwavering, the American flag catching the light as it waved gently against the morning sky. Both men stopped beneath it, breathing hard, but neither looked tired. For a long moment they just stood there, two men under one flag, one past mistake, and one shared future. Coleman wiped the sweat from his brow. "I don't know if I'll ever earn forgiveness," he said quietly. Elijah looked up at the flag, then back at him. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn," he said. "It's something you grow into." The words lingered, not like a lecture, but like something you carry with you, because it refuses to fade. The narrator's voice returned slow and steady, like the morning itself. "Respect isn't written in laws. It's written in how we treat one another." Elijah smiled, took a step forward, and nodded toward the path ahead. "Come on," he said. "Let's finish what we started." They began to run again, side by side, stride for stride. No sirens, no shouting, no fear. Just two men moving towards something better. As the camera panned back, the morning light stretched across the horizon, warm and golden, washing over the road like a promise. The flag fluttered behind them, steady in the breeze. And for the first time since that day, both men looked free, not because of who they were, but because of who they'd chosen to become. The voiceover closed the story with a quiet, reflective tone. "Sometimes redemption doesn't happen in courtrooms or headlines. It happens here in the small, steady steps we take toward understanding." And under the rising sun of Ridgewood Hills, the governor and the officer kept running, not to escape, but to remember how far they'd come. And that's the story of how one morning, one mistake became the beginning of something bigger than both of them. A lesson that respect isn't a title and justice isn't a badge. It lives in how we choose to treat one another every single day. If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who still believes change is possible. And if you'd like to hear more stories that remind us what humanity and courage truly mean, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps our team creating heartfelt stories that speak to truth, compassion, and second chances. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We remember what they make us feel.